We greet you once again from Santa Rosa, California. Our ministry, Revelation 14:1, dedicated to spreading the truth of the Bible, correcting the false interpretations that Christianity has been flooded with since those dark days, the dark ages, when the truth was trampled down by Satan and his angels and his messengers on earth during the dark ages, the period between 538 AD to 1798. After that began the Reformation from the 500s, led by Martin Luther. And even till today, after so many years, Christianity has still been flooded with false teaching. Our topic we've been studying from last week is the indigenous of the lands. That's a topic that even the United Nations recognize, the indigenous. We also know that the indigenous from last week's the last study that we made, part 1, that the indigenous are the first settlers of any place in the world. If we remember correctly, we saw this map of the whole world, and the color coding showed where the descendants of the three sons of Noah, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, settled. These are some studies that took place over time. How accurate it is, we do not really know. But this map, you see that yellow represents the sons of Japheth, which is Eastern Europe or the Eastern Bloc, Asia, right down to the Pacific, and goes right up to Russia. And according to this study, they are the sons of Japheth, the eldest son. And then the green, which are the sons of Shem. Shem was the youngest son, and represented there on the map as the Western world. We know these countries as the West. When you refer to the West, it's Europe, Western Europe, Americas, there are North America. Those are the Western world, or the sons of Shem. And then, according to this study, the sons of Japheth are not sons of Ham. They went down and settled in Africa, the whole continent of Africa. So this is some of the study, one of the studies. Another gave us this study. It's more recent to the time after they dispersed. Remember when they settled on the plains of China, and this is what happened. It's also color coded green. For green, those are the sons of Ham. They settled around that area initially. According to the other map, they then moved down and occupied Africa, the continent of Africa. And also we have the sons of Japheth. They are in red, and they occupied, you see most of them traveled down to the east and occupied the eastern bloc. And also the ones in black are the sons of the ones in black are the sons of Japheth. Japheth. The ones in red are the sons of Shem. So these are some of the studies that have taken place in the past that we do not have to reinvent the wheel, but just add on to this study. So this week in particular, since I am interested in tracing back my own ancestry as a Fijian, I know that my ancestors settled on the island of Fiji, right out there in the South Pacific. It's east of Australia and north of New Zealand, a group of 300 islands. And that's where our ancestors settled. We all know that they all came from this area after Noah. Then the three sons began to spread out all over the world and occupy the whole world. We will try and see whether the Bible can tell us how our ancestors, my ancestors, came to occupy Fiji. So we'll move on from there. It says, I mentioned last week that we can all trace our ancestry back to one of the children of Noah. The three sons of Noah that survived the flood with Noah and the wife. I would specifically want to know how my ancestors happened to land on the island of Vitlevu and claim the indigeneity of the islands of Fiji. So how did they reach those faraway islands? In some studies we know that the Pacific Islanders were very good navigators. Read what is written about them. The navigators exploring the navigational voyages of Polynesians more than 1,000 years ago, 6 centuries before Columbus sailed to America. So these Polynesians, as they addressed in this study, they sailed all over the world. They already been to the Americas. According to legends, Hawaiians, Tahitians, and Maoris are one people. You can see that by their physical structure, the color of their skin, and their facial. These are one people. Their ancestors having sailed for months before settling the widely scattered islands of the South Pacific. Early Polynesians, using the winds, stars, flights of birds, and other natural signs, guided their canoes across an ocean larger than Europe and North America combined. Those oceans were wide, and they made a comparison there. You combine the continent of America and Europe, those vast oceans are much bigger than that. These voyages are detailed by producer Sanford Lowe, who has recorded oral traditions of the seafaring people of the atolls of Satawal in the Central Caroline Islands. He also chronicles like passing of ancient navigational knowledge by Palu, the navigator, Maui Palug, to his people. But as Palug sadly reflects, he said, "After me, this last navigator of the Pacific, I am afraid there will be no more navigators." Because that skill that God had given to these early Polynesian navigators have gone missing. How? Maybe because of the new inventions, maybe because of the new things that have come into the lives of the Pacific Islanders, that they've lost the skill of navigating using the stars and the sun and the moon and all natural things that they use during that time. This is about Fiji. It says the Lapita people, another record that tells us about these people of the Pacific. It says, this is the first account of the Lapita peoples, a common ancestor of the Polynesians, Micronesians, and Austronesians speaking Melanesians, who over the last 4,000 years colonized the islands of the Pacific. 4,000 years ago. So if we think about that, we are 2,000 years away from Jesus' time. So from Jesus' time going back 2,000 years, we'll know, if we draw a timeline, that it comes to about the time of Abraham. So they said that, according to this study, it says, during that time of Abraham, when Abraham was alive, the Melanesians, the Polynesians, the Melanesians and the Micronesians were crisscrossing these vast oceans. So it was during that time, during Abraham's time, 4,000 years. That number should be in our minds now. 4,000 years, if we trace back 4,000 years, it takes us back to Abraham's time. Abraham lived about 2,000 years away from Jesus. 2,000 years after him, Jesus was born. Okay, so keep that in mind. Its purpose is to provide answers to some of the most puzzling archaeological and anthropological questions. Who were these Lapita people? Who were these Lapita people? What was their history? How were they able to travel such great distances? See, they're questioning these. And why did they do so? Recent discoveries, several by the author of this book, have begun at last to yield a coherent picture of these elusive peoples. So they are wondering, how come these tiny islands out there in the Pacific, how come these tiny islands were inhabited? Because they know that most of the islands were uninhabited after the Great Flood. So somehow people, the descendants of the three sons of Noah, reached these islands and occupied them, and they are the indigenous of those islands. So the puzzle is, or the mystery is, how did these people reach those faraway islands? Let's bring it to the Bible perspective. We know these people exist. Melanesians, Polynesians, Micronesians, who occupy the Pacific Islands. How did they get there? Right from the plains of China during Nimrod's time. Let's trace back. Noah's flood was about 3,500 BC. 3,000 years before Christ, that was when the flood came about. Ebba is a character that we should know of, lived about 500 years later, which is 3000 BC. We'll go in more detail a little later. And then Abraham, we've just mentioned, he lived around 2200 BC. And then the United Israeli Kingdom came into being 1042 BC, 1000 years before Christ. This was when King Saul, remember King Saul, came to being and he became the first king. And then the dividing of that kingdom into the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom. What are their names? The northern kingdom is Israel, and the southern kingdom is Judea. So that happened around 922 BC. We are trying to link my ancestors, how they reached those faraway islands, to biblical times. So that's when these things are happening out there in the Middle East. But we are trying to link how our people ended up on the isles of the Pacific. Matthew 1:14, this is where we bring all our clues from.
17.
It says, Matthew 1 verse 17. It says, so all the generations from Abraham to David are, how many generations? 14 generations. And from David until the carrying away into Babylon are 14 generations. And from the carrying away into Babylon unto Christ are 14 generations. So 14, 14, 14. 14 plus 14 is 28, plus another 14 is 42 generations altogether. From the time of Abraham, we just found out 2200 BC, to Jesus Christ. So remember the 4,000 years back from where they traced the Lapita people of the Pacific? It's about the same time as Abraham. We're tracing here from Matthew 1:17. So when the Lapita study is saying 4,000 years back, the Pacific navigators were crisscrossing the oceans, we are thinking about Abraham. That's the same time. During Abraham's time, when they were walking the deserts, remember Abraham? He left his town of Ur in the north and was told by God to go down to where he will tell him to go. And he left his father's home place and went to wherever God was sending him. During that time, while Abraham was crossing the deserts, our forefathers, according to the Lapita study, were crisscrossing the vast oceans, not only of the Pacific, but Pacific, the Indian Ocean, and other ocean, Atlantic Ocean. Same time as when Abraham came. So you try and bring the two pictures into place. Looking looking at the Bible scenery now, while at the same time the studies, and that's dated back to the time of Abraham. There are no other records that stated that other groups left for the seas. There's no other records that says that. Then let's return to Noah in Genesis. Noah, in Genesis chapter 10, it says, and the sons of Javan. This is a character that we should be remembering. His sons are Elisha, Tarshish, Kittim, and Dodanim. Verse 5, by these were the isles of the Gentiles divided in their hands. The isles of the Gentiles were divided into the hands of who? The 4 sons of Javan. Remember that name, Javan. To his sons were given the isles. Which isles, we do not know yet. In the end, that was the King James Version. See how the New International Version, the Bible says. The sons of Javan, Elisha, Tarshish, the Kittites, and the Rodanites. From these, the maritime peoples spread into their territories by their clans within their nations, each with its own language. It says the maritime people, they went and occupied all the islands, all those lands surrounded by sea, the maritime. So we see the connections are coming up now. So during that time, in the time of Javan, we'll find out what time did these men come up. Javan, his children were given the isles, the maritime, to go and occupy those islands. So 4,000 years, remember, these Melanesian, Polynesians, and Micronesians were crisscrossing the oceans of the world. What time is represented by Javan and his 4 sons? Let's carry on. The generations of Noah. Let's look at it on a timeline. It says, Noah, he was born 1,048 years from creation. When God created Adam and Eve, 1,048 years later, Noah was born. After he was born, he was 500 years old. Was it 500 or 600?
500. Oh, 600.
The flood took place. After the floods, the lifespan, okay, so Noah, and then he was 500 years old when he had his sons, Japheth, Ham, and Cush.
Shem.
Shem. Japheth, Ham, and Shem. And Shem. So these two have to be swapped. 500 years after Noah, he had children. So the children are here. Oh yeah, okay, so it's there. And 100 years after, you see, There's a big difference. Before the flood, if you read the Bible records, they were about 500, 600 years old before they had children. Huh? 500, 600 years. Noah was 500 years old when he had Japheth, Ham, and Shem. So 100 years later was the flood. So these children were already 100 years old when they were in that ark. Yeah. They did not have children yet. After Japheth, if you read the records, he was 100 years old when he had who? Javan. That's where Javan came in. Japheth's son is Javan. And Javan, if you read, Japheth's brother was Ham. Ham's son was Cush. And Cush's son was Nimrod. And what do you know about Nimrod? He was the great hunter. He was the one that built those cities of Babel and all the cities of the plain. Nimrod. And what else do we know about Nimrod? He led out in the building of that tower that they said we were going to build this tower to where God is. And they were doing that. And what happened to them? God confused them with different languages. Okay? They were confused, so they were not able to finish that tower. So when did that happen? That happened here, after Nimrod. Nimrod was born here, so 90 years later, Nimrod had children. And it was during this time that Nimrod was leading out in that, building that tower. And the confusion came, and so it was after that that the people began to spread out. Okay? Where's Abraham? No, Abraham is nowhere here yet. He's a few generations later. So think about that. Think about that. The Lapita people, they were crisscrossing the world when Abraham was walking the deserts between Babylon and Canaan. The Lapita people were already crisscrossing the vast oceans of the world. So I hope that this timeline will help us put our thought into the right frame to figure out when did these people live and go towards their destinations. Isaiah 66 says this, "For I know their works." This is Isaiah prophesying about the last days. "For I know their works and their thoughts. It shall come that I will gather all nations and tongues." Remember, now they're talking about tongues, the different languages. After the confusion in Babel, people walked away with different tongues. "And they shall come and see my glory." So during that time, all of God's people will be able to see God's glory. Verse 19, "And I will set a sign among them, so wherever they go, God will set a sign. And I will send those that escape of them unto the nations, to Tarshish, to Pool, to Lud, that draw the bow, to Tubal and Javan." Javan's name is coming up here. "To the isles afar off." So these two were given the islands, the faraway islands, to go to Javan. Why? Because they were being persecuted for being true to God. It was during this time that those, remember, after the flood, they settled around Mount Ararat, and they began to disperse, and they built cities, and they began to have other gods. But some people kept the God, the true God, and these people were persecuted. And this is what is happening to Javan. I'm getting it here, that Javan was one of those people that kept the true God that Noah and his ancestors worshipped. So because of that, they were persecuted, and God allowed them to travel. Javan was given the islands afar off. Take your ancestors to run away there. So they came away with the true knowledge of God. Javan and his 4 sons that we've read to the islands afar off that have not heard my fame, neither have seen my glory, and they shall declare my glory among the Gentiles. So you see, these descendants of Javan, his 4 sons, were given the islands far away. There's a hill back in Fiji. It's called Naidhuwa Retiola. For those who come from the district of the Wainimbuka district in Fiji will know of this hill. It's close to a village called Nassau. And Nassau Toka is the village on the main road, freeway there. So this hill they named Naidhuwa Retiola. Remember when they left, when they dispersed from Babel, they came with their unique language. So some of these hills, some of these landmarks in Fiji, you will recognize that the original settlers had a knowledge of Jehovah God that we know of today. One clear example is this hill in the Wainimbuka district, which they named Naidhuwa Retiola. And that's not the exact hill there. I couldn't get a picture, but it showed that to give you an idea of what the original settlers of Fiji came with. They had the original knowledge of the God that Noah served. So they kept it, and they were persecuted where they were. That's why they had to leave. God gave them the skills. That's how they read the skies, they read the stars, and they were able to go through those vast oceans, which is described in that what we read as larger than Europe and the Americas combined. These people occupied the Pacific Islands, and my ancestors ended up on Fiji. They named that hill Naidhuwa Retiola. They knew about God. They were not primitive, they were not cannibals like we've been taught today. Today, we Fijians believe that our ancestors were cannibals. we have to find out where those stories come from. Because according to Bible records and according to evidence on the land, they were not cannibals. They were worshippers of the true God. How were they still known? Ezekiel, that question is, then how were they, if they had left, how were they still identified back in the homelands? Ezekiel recorded this. Javan, Tubal, and Meshach, they were thy merchants. They traded the persons of man and the vessels of brass in thy market. So this is Ezekiel's lamentation about the city of Tyre. We know from biblical record that the city collapsed because it was so sinful that it just collapsed and disappeared in the sea. And Ezekiel here is lamenting, writing a poem about this city. And he's saying, mentioning Javan, Tubal, Meshach. Those were the sons of Japheth. They were thy merchants. So you know, we're talking about Javan. What was he? He was a merchant, he was a trader. In verse 19 of that same chapter says, Dan also and Javan, what were they doing? Going to and fro, occupied in thy fairs. Bright-eyed, they were trading these. Cassia and Calamus were in thy market. So, Tyre is right back there in the Mediterranean. These people were traveling to and fro with their trade. And what were they trading? Iron, a bright iron, cassia, and calamus. They had it in this, wherever they've settled all over the Pacific, and they took it back. Where? Right to Tyre. And Ezekiel is lamenting here about Tyre. So they were taking these things back, right to that area. And you see, who else trades in Tyre? Verse 17 says, Judah and the land of Israel. That's where they were meeting up again. Huh? They were thy merchants. They traded in thy market. What did they trade? Wheat of Minnith and Panak and honey and oil and balm. Don't you think that these traders from the Pacific brought their things, sold it there, and bought some of these and took it back? That's where they interacted. Damascus, we learn about Damascus. Also in that area, the capital city of the northern kingdom, was the merchants, and that's what they traded there. And verse 19 says, Dan and also and Javan, they went to and fro, right from the Pacific. They took their trade and took it right up to Tyre. So you see, our legend tells us that they were going back and forth to Africa. The truth is in here. They came not only to Africa, they may have stopped over in Africa on the way, but then they went right back to Tyre. Interaction between Javan and Judah. Judah was Jacob's son and many generations after Javan. Tyre was their meeting place where they bring their wares as traders. The generations or the descendants of Javan who had occupied the Pacific Islands, and the generations of Judah who had occupied Canaan. This is where they meet. Where? Out in Tyre, the trade center of the world at that time. Our ancestors in Fiji were known to be great navigators. And legends tell us that they were going back to Africa many times. That's what we hear, stories that were passed down from by mouth. However, the Bible records show that they were going right back to Tyre, the trading center of the world at that time. We only hear that, oh yeah, they were going back to Africa, because the story is being told to us that our ancestors came from Africa. That's why the legend only goes back there. But the truth in the Bible says that these navigators, Javan and his descendants who occupied the Pacific, they not only went to Africa, where did they go to? Right back to Tyre. That's where they met up with Judah. So that's the proof of their interaction. What further? This is another record that's recorded by the American consul to Fiji in the 1847. He was the representative of America and he was stationed in Fiji. This is what he recorded in one of his letters that he wrote back to his mother, who was in America. What further fueled this interest is a copy of the letter obtained by this newspaper, it was the Fiji Times, written by former American consul to Fiji, John B. Williams, to his mother on October 24th, 1847. This was about the time the missionaries came to Fiji, and published in the New Zealand Journal. He said in the letter, "The Fiji men's manners, customs, and habits are precisely what we read of in ancient Jews. Doubtless, they are descendants of the lost tribes of Israel." So, according to this man, there's no proof. The only proof that he has is what he's seeing. And he is seeing the children, the male children, they were already circumcised. This is in 1847. The missionaries had just arrived. He may have come with the missionaries, but the children that were there were already, it was their custom, it was their tradition to circumcise their children. Where did that come from? We know that circumcision, according to the Bible, came from Abraham. Abraham was told by God, circumcise all your males to show the world that you are mine. You are my people, Abraham's descendants. And that includes his first son, Ishmael. So they were also circumcised. On another, I don't think I put that up. His other observation was he was seeing these Fiji men trading. He said they were good traders, just like the Jews. They knew the Jews as very good traders. And he was noticing that too among the Fiji men. They were trading. Everything they did was through trade. The interaction amongst villages. So he said that they were good traders. So they are the descendants of Abraham, not physically, but spiritually. How did they know of that? How did they accept that? Remember, they came Javan, the sons of Javan. That was few generations before Abraham. So when they came, they were not circumcised, because that tradition was not there then. but their interactions through trade. Even as Abraham believed God and it was accounted to him for righteousness, know too therefore that they which are of faith, the same are the children of Abraham. Paul is telling the Galatians, or the Jews at that time, who were forcing the Gentiles who were joining the church to be circumcised. If you want to join the church, this is God's church, and God wants you to be circumcised. And Paul is telling his fellow Jews, Abraham had faith in God, and that was accounted to him. These people, they are not Jews. Why should they be circumcised? But they have faith in Jesus Christ. Because they have faith, they are also Abraham's descendants. So they are not physically or through bloodline Abraham's descendant, but through their faith in Jesus Christ. And the scripture foreseeing that God would justify the heathen through faith, preached before the gospel unto Abraham, saying, in thee shall all nations be blessed. So somehow this indigenous of the Pacific Islands accepted the God of Abraham. And because of that, they allowed all their male descendants to be circumcised. When the white men came onto the islands, they noticed that all the kids, male kids, were already circumcised. And somehow, through this trade, according to our study of the Bible, they were going to and fro, and they were meeting up with the sons of Judah on Tyre. So after Tyre drowned in the ocean, what would have happened? They would have still gone there and went straight to Judah. There may also be physical descendants. So we know, because they were not descendant of Abraham, but now they have been circumcised in the 1800s, we know that somehow they have accepted the God of Abraham. How? Because of the going back and forth to Judah and back. Blood or physical descendants of Abraham may have decided to join them in their journey back to their newfound homeland, Fiji. Persecution continued up there. Persecution of those who wanted to worship the true God of heaven. They wanted to worship Jehovah. And when these people came, they were already worshiping Jehovah. They talked, they said, yeah, why don't we join us in the islands? There's such a big island, beautiful, peaceful. Let's go. So they went down and joined them. These are physical Jews or descendants of Abraham. So even though we have descendants of Javan who had accepted the God of Israel, and because of that they circumcised their kids, they also have physical or bloodline descendants of Abraham who joined them later on the islands. Not only in Fiji, but on the other islands of the Pacific. Folk stories we have may be true. Stories passed down by word of mouth have been continuously concluded as false because it was not recorded by the early missionaries. May turn out to be the truth. We believe in this, what was written down as the true history of Fiji. These things that were written down by those who came into the islands. especially the white missionaries who came later. And what they recorded was these people are cannibals. Because of the word of God that we bring to them, they've changed now. These are cannibals who occupy this land. But according to Bible linkages that we found out here, they were not cannibals. They were worshippers of God the Father. Though we can safely trace back our ancestry to Javan, who was given the isles afar off to go to and inhabit, continuous interaction may have led to other settlers who came over after Jacob. Jacob, the grandson of Abraham, or even after the division of the 12 of Israel and Judah. So remember, there were 10 tribes that just disappeared. Those 10 tribes, somehow, there are other stories which we have to follow up, that some of them decided to travel, and they ended up in the Pacific Islands as well. So those are other things that we can follow, stories that we can follow up, which were just myths or legends passed on by word of mouth. There's some truth in it. Now we can prove that some of the written records are far from the truth, even though they were written by missionaries themselves. That's where we will end today. And I hope that this ministry, Revelation 14, being able to trace back our ancestry, back to Noah's children during the flood, you will also be able to use the Bible records to trace back your ancestry. You should be able to end up with one of Noah's children, wherever in the world you may be. The Chinese will be able to trace their ancestry back to one of the three boys. The Russians, those from Europe, everyone, because that was the starting point, the new starting point, apart from Adam during creation. So that's where we will end today, and I hope that the Bible will always be there to enlighten us on whatever topic we are in the dark in. So let us bow our head in